This content is presented for educational, historical, and cultural analysis purposes. All theological interpretations shared here reflect the views of various scholars and traditions, and should be understood as according to the interpretation of unredacted rather than absolute doctrinal claims. Viewers are encouraged to study, verify, and form their own understanding through personal research and spiritual guidance.
He appears in 14 verses across the entire Hebrew Bible. No birth, no death, no genealogy, no parents named, no tribe, no nation. He simply walks into the narrative of Genesis, blesses the most important figure in the Abrahamic tradition, receives a tithe from him, and disappears. For 3,000 years, theologians, mystics, rabbis, scholars, and philosophers have been trying to figure out who or what Melchizedek actually was. And the answers that serious scholarship has produced are, in many ways, stranger and more compelling than any supernatural explanation. Today we're going to do something that almost no popular treatment of this subject does. We're going to look at Melchizedek from every serious angle available: the textual, the historical, the archaeological, the comparative religious, and the theological, and see what a careful, honest examination actually reveals. Because the mystery of Melchizedek is not just about one obscure figure, it touches on some of the deepest questions in the history of religion. How were priests made? What gave them authority? And what happens when a sacred tradition claims that authority came from somewhere older than itself? Stay with me. The text itself, what Genesis actually says. Let's begin where everything must begin, with the primary source. Melchizedek appears in Genesis 14 in a passage that sits somewhat awkwardly within the larger narrative structure of the book. The chapter describes a war between 4 kings and 5 kings, conflict scholars have debated intensively, and Abraham's pursuit of raiders who captured his nephew Lot. After the rescue, as Abraham returns, he encounters 2 figures, the king of Sodom and then Melchizedek. The relevant verses are 18 through 20, and they are worth examining carefully. And Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was priest of God Most High, and he blessed him and said, "Blessed be Abram by God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand." And Abram gave him 1/10 of everything. That's it, 3 verses. And from those 3 verses, an enormous tradition grew. Several things in these verses are immediately worth examining. First, the name itself. Melchizedek in Hebrew, Melchizedek, is a compound of 2 words. Melech, meaning king, and Zedek, meaning righteousness or justice. So the name means, roughly, my king is righteousness, or king of righteousness. This is not an unusual type of name in ancient Semitic languages. Compound names, incorporating royal and divine titles, were common in the ancient Near East. Second, his title, King of Salem. Salem is most commonly identified by biblical scholars with Jerusalem. The name Jerusalem itself, possibly containing Salem as its roots, from the Semitic shalom, peace. If this identification is correct, Melchizedek was the king of the city that would later become the most sacred site in the Abrahamic tradition. Centuries before David captured it, centuries before Solomon built the temple there. Third, and this is the element that generated the most theological freight, he is called Kohen Le'el Elyon, priest of God Most High. The title El Elyon, God Most High, is a divine epithet known from ancient Canaanite religious texts, particularly the Ugaritic literature discovered at Ras Shamra in modern-day Syria in the 1920s and 1930s. It appears to have been a title for the head of the Canaanite pantheon, El, distinguished from other divine titles by its emphasis on supreme sovereignty. This creates an immediate and genuinely fascinating question. Was the God Most High that Melchizedek served the same deity that Abraham worshipped? Or was this a different theological tradition that the Genesis narrative is, in effect, absorbing and validating? El Elyon and the ancient Near Eastern context. To understand what Melchizedek's priestly title meant to an ancient reader, we need to spend some time in the religious world of the 2nd millennium BCE Levant. The ancient Near East was not religiously uniform. The region encompassing modern Israel, Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan hosted a complex, layered religious landscape in which different cities had patron deities. Divine councils were understood to govern the cosmos, and the titles and epithets of deities often overlapped or were transferred between traditions. The god El, whose name simply means god or deity in Semitic languages, was the head of the Ugaritic pantheon, the divine father figure presiding over an assembly of gods. His titles in Ugaritic texts include Father of Years, Creator of Creatures, and the Kind and Holy One. The epithet Elyon, meaning Most High or Supreme, distinguished him as the highest in the divine hierarchy. When Genesis uses the phrase El Elyon for Melchizedek's deity, it is using a specifically Canaanite religious vocabulary. This has been the subject of serious scholarly discussion for over a century. One interpretation held by many scholars in the tradition of historical critical biblical studies is that the Genesis narrative reflects a moment of religious synthesis, an encounter between the emerging Israelite tradition centered on the God of Abraham and an existing Canaanite high God tradition centered in the city of Salem. The narrative on this reading is making a theological claim. The God of Abraham and the El Elyon of Salem are the same deity. Abraham's payment of a tithe to Melchizedek and his acceptance of Melchizedek's blessing would then represent a narrative legitimization of this equation. By accepting the blessing of El Elyon's priests, Abraham acknowledges that the God who brought him victory is the same God worshipped at Salem. Another interpretation, particularly within traditional Jewish and Christian exegesis, is that Melchizedek was a genuine monotheist, a figure who, outside the line of Abraham, maintained worship of the true God. On this reading, he represents a primordial religious tradition that predated the Abrahamic covenant, but pointed toward the same ultimate reality. Both of these interpretations have serious scholarly and theological defenders. What neither requires is treating the text as either purely legendary or straightforwardly biographical history. The text is doing theological work, and understanding what that work is illuminates far more than a simple historical question about one person's identity. The silence of Psalm 110. The second appearance of Melchizedek in the Hebrew Bible is in Psalm 110 verse 4, a single line that would eventually generate enormous theological consequences. The Lord has sworn and will not change his mind. You are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. This verse is addressed to a king. The psalm is generally understood by scholars as a royal psalm, possibly composed for the coronation or enthronement of a Davidic king in Jerusalem. The claim being made is that this king holds a priestly authority, and that this authority is traced not to Aaron, not to the Levitical line, but to Melchizedek. Why would a Davidic king need a priestly legitimacy distinct from the Aaronic priesthood? Here, the historical context is illuminating. Jerusalem, before David captured it from the Jebusites in approximately the 10th century BCE, had its own existing religious and priestly traditions. David's establishment of Jerusalem as his capital required integrating these existing traditions into the new Israelite state, or at least not overtly discarding them. Some scholars, including John Emerton and other specialists in Psalms, have suggested that Psalm 110 reflects the absorption of pre-Davidic Jebusite priestly traditions into the Israelite royal ideology. By tracing the king's priestly authority to Melchizedek, the ancient priest king of Salem, the Davidic line was, in effect, claiming continuity with whatever sacred tradition had existed in Jerusalem before David. This is a historically recognizable pattern. When a new power takes over a sacred site, it typically claims inheritance from the site's existing sanctity, rather than starting from zero. David's Jerusalem absorbed Salem's religious prestige by connecting to its most ancient representative. The theological implication, which would be developed extensively later, is that Melchizedek represents a priestly order that is older and in some sense more primordial than the Mosaic Aaronic system. The Dead Sea Scrolls, 11q, Melchizedek. In 1947, with the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran, the study of Melchizedek took a dramatic turn. Among the texts discovered was a fragmentary document, now designated 11q Melchizedek, a text from what scholars date to approximately the 1st century BCE, belonging to the community, generally identified with the Essenes. This text is one of the most discussed documents in Second Temple Jewish studies. The 11q Melchizedek text presents Melchizedek not merely as a historical priest-king, but as a celestial, angelic figure, a heavenly being who will preside over a final judgment, execute divine vengeance on the forces of evil, and proclaim liberty to the captives. The text weaves together passages from Leviticus, Deuteronomy, Psalms, and Isaiah, applying them to Melchizedek as an exalted divine agent. This is a remarkable interpretive development. The sparse, enigmatic figure of Genesis 14 has been transformed within Jewish interpretive tradition into something approaching a heavenly high priest or angelic advocate. What this tells us is that by the 1st century BCE, Melchizedek had already accumulated a long history of interpretive elaboration within Judaism. He was not simply a minor character noted for a brief encounter with Abraham. He had become a figure onto whom deep theological questions were being projected, questions about the nature of priesthood, divine justice, and the mediation between humanity and the divine. The Qumran community, living in the desert and maintaining its own priestly traditions, in opposition to what it considered a corrupted Jerusalem priesthood, found in Melchizedek a figure who represented priestly legitimacy outside the existing institutional structures. That is not coincidental. Marginalized religious communities often find their theological validation in figures whose authority bypasses the established order, Philo of Alexandria, and the allegorical Melchizedek. Philo of Alexandria, the Jewish philosopher who lived roughly from 20 BCE to 50 CE, engaged with Melchizedek in several of his writings, most notably in Legum Allegoriae, Allegorical Interpretation, and De Congressu. For Philo, working in the tradition of Hellenistic Jewish philosophy that sought to harmonize Hebrew scripture with Greek thought, particularly Platonic philosophy. Melchizedek was an allegorical figure representing the Logos, the divine rational principle that mediates between God and the material world. Philo notes that Melchizedek is both king and priest, a combination he reads as the union of royal reason, the mind's sovereignty over the passions, and priestly virtue, the soul's orientation toward God. He reads Salem not as a city, but as peace, the inner peace of the philosopher who has achieved harmony between reason and desire. He also notes what he calls the self-taught nature of Melchizedek's wisdom, the idea that his knowledge came not through instruction or genealogy, but through direct divine illumination. This would become an influential idea in later theological and mystical traditions. Philo's Melchizedek is not a historical figure at all in his framework. He is a philosophical archetype, the ideal of the person whose mind and soul are simultaneously directed toward justice and toward God. Whether or not Philo thought there was a historical Melchizedek beneath the allegory is not entirely clear from his texts, but his primary interest was in what the figure meant, not in recovering biographical facts. The letter to the Hebrews, the most extensive treatment, the longest and most theologically developed treatment of Melchizedek in any ancient text, is found in the New Testament letter to the Hebrews, specifically chapters 5 through 7, where the author develops an extended argument using Melchizedek as the key to a theological claim about priesthood. The argument in Hebrews is sophisticated and depends heavily on the silence of the Genesis text. The author observes that Genesis records no parentage for Melchizedek, no birth, no death. He reads this textual silence as theologically significant, as a deliberate absence that points to something beyond ordinary human priesthood. The phrase used in Hebrews 7:3 has become one of the most discussed passages in New Testament scholarship. Melchizedek is described as without father, without mother, without genealogy, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, but resembling the Son of God. He continues a priest forever. The interpretive move here is technically called argumentum ex silentio, an argument from silence. Because the text doesn't record Melchizedek's birth or death, the author of Hebrews treats this absence as meaningful. In the typological reading of scripture common in that era, the silence points toward the eternal. Scholars debate whether the author of Hebrews believed Melchizedek was literally eternal or simply used his textual characterization as a type, a prefiguring figure whose literary qualities foreshadow something greater. Most modern New Testament scholars, including Harold Attridge in his landmark commentary on Hebrews, tend toward the typological interpretation, Melchizedek as literary figure whose textual characteristics are being used as theological arguments, not as a claim about Melchizedek's literal nature. The broader argument of Hebrews, chapters 5 to 7, is about the relative superiority of the Melchizedekian priestly order over the Levitical order. The author's point, made through a fascinating reading of Genesis 14, is that when Abraham paid tithes to Melchizedek, Levi, Abraham's eventual descendant, was, in a sense, present in Abraham's body, and thus also paid tithes to Melchizedek. This makes the Melchizedekian priesthood older and higher than the Levitical one. Whatever one makes of this argument theologically, it represents an extraordinary example of ancient exegesis, a sophisticated interpretive tradition using careful textual analysis to make claims about religious authority and succession. Rabbinic interpretations, the many faces of Melchizedek. Jewish rabbinic tradition, collected in the Talmud and the Midrashim, offers several competing interpretations of Melchizedek that are worth examining for what they reveal about how this figure was understood across different centuries and communities. One influential rabbinic tradition identifies Melchizedek with Shem, son of Noah, the idea being that Shem was still alive at the time of Abraham, a calculation based on the genealogical lifespans given in Genesis, and that he maintained the original antediluvian priestly tradition. On this reading, Melchizedek is not a mysterious outsider, but a figure whose genealogy is, in principle, traceable through the Genesis narrative, just not at the moment of the Genesis 14 encounter. The identification with Shem appears in the Targum Pseudo-Jonathan, an Aramaic translation and expansion of the Torah, as well as in various Midrashic collections. It was a way of domesticating the enigmatic figure, giving him a genealogy that the text withholds, integrating him into the known ancestral framework. However, another strand of rabbinic thought, particularly in the Babylonian Talmud tractate Nedarim, discusses Melchizedek's priestly status being transferred or removed because of a perceived protocol error. He blessed Abraham before blessing God in his speech. According to this tradition, as a consequence, the priestly line passed from Melchizedek to Abraham's descendants. This is a fascinating interpretive move. It addresses the otherwise uncomfortable question of why a non-Israelite priest could bless the father of Israel and receive a tithe from him, and resolves it by having Melchizedek's priestly authority ultimately transferred to the Abrahamic line. What the diversity of rabbinic interpretations shows us is that Melchizedek remained genuinely unsettled within Jewish tradition, a figure who generated multiple, sometimes contradictory explanations across different scholarly communities and centuries. Gnostic and early Christian traditions. Beyond mainstream Christianity and Judaism, Melchizedek became a significant figure in various Gnostic and heterodox traditions of the early centuries CE. A Coptic text discovered at Nag Hammadi in Egypt in 1945, part of the same remarkable library that reshaped understanding of early Christian diversity, is actually titled Melchizedek. This Gnostic text presents Melchizedek as a heavenly high priest, a cosmic figure who descends, suffers, and rises, in a pattern that scholars like Birger Pearson have analyzed as a Gnostic reinterpretation of themes from Hebrews, combined with mythological elements from the broader, ancient Mediterranean religious environment. There was also, according to early church fathers, including Epiphanius of Salamis and Hippolytus of Rome, a sect called the Melchizedekians, a group that regarded Melchizedek as superior to Christ, or in some accounts as a heavenly power greater than the angelic hosts. Epiphanius describes them in his Panarion, his catalogue of heresies, as believing Melchizedek to be a divine intermediary force beyond ordinary human or angelic categories. The existence of these groups, whether or not their specific beliefs are accurately reported by hostile sources, like Epiphanius, tells us something important. In the early centuries of the Common Era, the figure of Melchizedek was sufficiently open-ended and theologically potent that different communities could project very different meanings onto him, from a model priest to a cosmic redeemer to a super-celestial divine power. The archaeology of Salem/Jerusalem. Let's ground all of this in what archaeology and ancient Near Eastern history can actually tell us about the city Melchizedek ruled. The identification of Salem with Jerusalem is not universally accepted. Some scholars have suggested other locations, but it is the dominant scholarly position, supported by the Jewish historian Josephus in the 1st century CE, by the consistent geographic logic of the Genesis 14 narrative. What we know archaeologically about the sites of Jerusalem in the Middle Bronze Age, the period that most scholars associate with the patriarchal narratives, roughly 2000 to 1550 BCE, though this dating is contested, is that the site shows evidence of occupation going back at least to the early Bronze Age, around 3500 BCE. The Ophel Ridge, the original settled area south of what would later become the Temple Mount, shows archaeological layers consistent with a small but established urban center. The site's attraction is geographical. It sits at the convergence of several significant valleys, controls access between the coastal plain and the Transjordanian Plateau, and has a reliable spring, the Gihon Spring, that would have made it a viable permanent settlement in a region where water sources were precious. Egyptian texts from the Middle Bronze Age, specifically the execration texts, ritual curse documents from roughly 1900 to 1800 BCE, mention a place called Rushalimum, widely identified by Egyptologists as Jerusalem. These are among the earliest extra-biblical references to the site. The fact that Egyptian texts felt the need to include Jerusalem in their ritual cursing formulas suggests it was a politically significant enough place to be worth noting, even if it wasn't a major urban center. This means that a priest-king ruling in Salem/Jerusalem during the period associated with Abraham would have been presiding over a real, established, politically recognized site, not a minor village or isolated sanctuary. Salem was a city in the genuine sense of the ancient Near Eastern term, a settled, walled, administratively organized community with its own political and religious identity. The religious traditions of such a site would have been old, locally established, and, given Jerusalem's later history, of enduring significance. When David captured the city and made it his capital, he was not founding something new on empty ground. He was taking over a location with deep existing sacred history. The priestly role in ancient Near Eastern contexts. To understand what Melchizedek's combined role as king and priest meant in its historical context, it's important to step back from later separations between political and religious authority that modern readers might take for granted. In ancient Near Eastern political theology, the combination of royal and priestly functions was not unusual. It was, in many contexts, the norm. The king was often understood as the primary mediator between the human community and the divine world. In Mesopotamia, the king performed essential religious rituals that maintained cosmic order. In Egypt, Pharaoh was himself divine. In Ugaritic literature, the king participates in sacrificial rituals that sustain the fertility of the land. The idea of a king who was also the chief priest of his city, which is what Melchizedek represents, was entirely standard in the ancient Levantine world. What was unusual from the later Israelites' perspective was the separation of these roles. The Mosaic system created a clear distinction. Kings from the tribe of Judah, Davidic line, priests from the tribe of Levi, Aaronic line. These were not to be conflated. King Uzziah's attempt to offer incense in the temple, described in 2 Chronicles as resulting in his being struck with leprosy, illustrates how seriously this separation was maintained in later Israelite religious law. Melchizedek, by contrast, occupied both roles simultaneously, and this is precisely why he was such a useful figure for later theological arguments. He represented a model of sacral authority that predated the Mosaic separation and could therefore be invoked as precedent for any tradition that wanted to claim a priestly authority, not dependent on Levitical genealogy. Why the absence of genealogy matters in the ancient world, and this cannot be overstated. Genealogy was not merely biographical information, it was the fundamental certificate of authority. Priestly legitimacy in the Israelite system depended entirely on genealogical continuity with Aaron. If you couldn't trace your lineage to Aaron, you couldn't be a priest. Full stop. The books of Ezra and Nehemiah record priests being excluded from priestly service after the return from Babylonian exile because they couldn't produce their genealogical records. The stakes were real. This makes the absence of any genealogy for Melchizedek not simply mysterious, it is, within the logic of the ancient world, deeply provocative. A priest without a genealogy was, in normal terms, not a legitimate priest at all. He had no credentials, no lineage, no institutional backing. And yet, Abraham, the father of the covenant, the foundational figure of the Israelite religious tradition, accepted his blessing and paid him a tithe. What the text seems to be asserting, and what later interpreters in every tradition recognized, is that Melchizedek's authority came from somewhere other than institutional genealogy. It was, in the text's framing, intrinsic rather than derived, rooted in his relationship with El Elyon directly, without the mediation of family lineage or tribal membership. This idea that genuine religious authority can exist outside institutional structures, that legitimacy can come from direct relationship with the divine rather than from certified ancestry, is one of the most persistent and generative ideas in the entire history of religion. And Melchizedek is, arguably, its oldest named representative in the Western religious tradition, the medieval and mystical traditions. The resonance of Melchizedek didn't diminish in the medieval period. If anything, it's intensified in certain mystical and esoteric traditions. In Jewish Kabbalah, Melchizedek became associated with the Sephirah of Tiferet, the central sphere on the Kabbalistic tree of life, associated with beauty, harmony, and the balancing of divine justice and divine mercy. The connection drew on his name, King of Righteousness, and his role as the point of contact between Abraham and the divine, which Kabbalists read as the intersection of different streams of divine energy. In Christian mystical tradition, figures from Meister Eckhart to Hildegard of Bingen engaged with Melchizedek as a symbol of the eternal priesthood, the dimension of sacred reality that transcends historical time and institutional form. In Islam, while Melchizedek is not mentioned by name in the Quran, Islamic scholarly tradition has engaged with the figure through the lens of the broader prophetic tradition, and some Islamic commentators have identified him with figures in the Quranic framework who maintained monotheism before the formal prophetic missions. What's striking across all of these traditions is the consistency of the interpretive pattern. Melchizedek consistently represents something prior, older than the institutional structures, older than the genealogical systems, older than the specific covenantal frameworks that organize each tradition. He is the figure at the edge of memory, pointing towards something that existed before the systems that now claim authority. What serious scholarship can and cannot establish. Let's be clear about the limits of what historical and textual scholarship can tell us about Melchizedek. There is no archaeological evidence for a specific individual named Melchizedek. No inscription, no seal, no administrative record confirms his existence as a historical person. This is not surprising. The vast majority of individuals mentioned in ancient texts leave no archaeological trace, and the Bronze Age record for Canaan is fragmentary at best. The Genesis 14 passage itself has been the subject of intense scholarly debate about its literary character and historical value. Some scholars, like John Van Seters, have argued that the chapter is a late composition with little historical value for reconstructing Bronze Age realities. Others, like Kenneth Kitchen, have defended the historical plausibility of the chapter's setting and details. The debate remains unresolved. What scholarship can establish is the following. The religious vocabulary used in connection with Melchizedek, El Elyon, Salem, the priest-king combination is historically grounded in what we know about ancient Canaanite religion and ancient Near Eastern political theology. The figure, whatever his ultimate historical status, is embedded in a genuine religious and cultural world that archaeology and comparative religion have substantially illuminated. The theological uses to which Melchizedek was put in the Dead Sea Scrolls, in Hebrews, in Philo, in rabbinic midrash are historically documented and intellectually serious engagements with a genuinely puzzling text. Understanding these interpretive traditions is not peripheral to understanding Melchizedek. In many ways, it is the story of Melchizedek, because outside of 14 verses in the Hebrew Bible, he exists only in the minds and texts of those who found him impossible to ignore. The enduring question, 3,000 years of interpretation have not resolved the basic question: who was Melchizedek? Was he a historical Canaanite priest-king of pre-Davidic Jerusalem, remembered in a tradition that the Genesis narrative absorbed and legitimized? Possibly. The historical and geographical context is consistent with this. Was he a symbolic figure, created or shaped by the editors of Genesis, to make a theological point about the universality of God's presence, that even outside the Abrahamic covenant, genuine encounter with the divine was possible? According to the interpretation of many critical scholars, yes, or at least partly. Was he, as the Qumran community believed, a celestial figure whose brief Genesis appearance was merely the earthly shadow of a heavenly reality? That interpretation had serious, learned defenders in the 1st century CE, and the textual basis for it is the same sparse Genesis passage that everyone else works from. Was he, as the author of Hebrews argued, a type, a figure whose literary characteristics were deliberately constructed to foreshadow a permanent, universal priesthood that transcends genealogy and institutional limitation? That reading has shaped Christian theology for 2,000 years. The remarkable thing is that all of these interpretations start from the same 14 verses. They are all serious attempts to make sense of a figure whose textual characterization, priest and king, unnamed origin, unnamed death, received tithe from Abraham, blessed by El Elyon, is just unusual enough to resist comfortable domestication into any single explanatory framework. He arrived without explanation. He left without ceremony. No one buried him because there's no record of him dying. No one traced his descendants because there's no record of him having any. He brought bread and wine. He spoke a blessing. He received the tithe. And then he was gone. The questions he left behind have occupied some of the finest minds in 3,000 years of religious thought. That perhaps is its own kind of priesthood.